Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new Record Club episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, where each week one of us recommends a record for the rest of us to hear, and we review it. And this is a special week, a special Record Club, because it's kind of something we threw around just because the 20th anniversary of this particular record is happening. I think has already happened.
Just last week.
Yeah, a couple of days ago. And we wanted to talk about it 20 years later, and it's an album. And from a group the podcast as a whole loves, but have never really gotten the chance to talk about. And that is, of course, Geogaddi by Boards of Canada. Ryley, this is your record club. It was your decision to move it to this. Why are we going to talk about Geogaddi and Boards of Canada?
So, longtime viewers of the podcast will know that I cut my teeth on electronic music. I've grown up with IDM, with techno, with acid house, all forms of like 90s electronica and beyond, of course. And one of the foundational groups for me, although I actually didn't discover them until I was like in my early teens, but still a foundational group for me, was always Boards of Canada. And in terms of the autobiographical stuff, like a lot of that is deeply tied in for me with their first album, Music Has the Right to Children, probably their most beloved and well-regarded record and my favorite record of theirs. But that's for another day, because today we're talking about the follow-up to that album, 2002's Geogaddi, which, as Jake mentioned, has just turned 20. And this is an album that I think in many ways is more fascinating and more full of layers and things to unpack even than Music Has the Right to Children. I think that it shares the mantle with that album of also being a masterpiece of a record. But there's also so much to say about this album, so much to dig into, so much that is misrepresented, misunderstood, often not even realized at all. And the thing I think to appreciate about Boards of Canada, who are, for all intents and purposes, a Scottish duo comprised of Michael Sanderson and Marcus Ian. And the thing to appreciate about Boards of Canada is that they are meticulous sound designers, more so even than musicians, although obviously I'm not going to be as pretentious as to say this is something greater than music. It is music, but it is also sound design in a lot of ways as well. It is collages of sound in a big way as well. It is collisions of samples and collisions of drum loops and collisions of instrumentation and weird contorted musicality. All of the big names in IDM have a unique sound that makes them instantly recognizable as a musical force, as a musical identity, and as a stake in the ground that lots of acts from various genres and influences would pull from in the decades to come. But Boards of Canada's sound is particularly special. It's influenced by childhood TV commercials and Sesame Street and these archaic snatches of things that resonated in their childhood that they've kind of contorted and twisted into these strangely emotional and oftentimes melancholic reflections on the process of growing up and like the way that memories can melt and collide together. And there's something really tangibly nostalgic and deeply emotional about Boards of Canada's music that I think in many ways makes them sometimes even more appealing, certainly gives them an immediacy among big name IDM acts that means a lot of people gravitate to them on a personal level, more so than a lot of the other big name artists whose music I think can often be misrepresented but described somewhat understandingly in colder terms. Whereas Boards of Canada, the thing that has always sort of defined their sound, if we were to sort of reduce it, would be to say that it's a warm sound. It's a sound that evokes something personal and familiar and nostalgic and bucolic as well in terms of the kind of like natural landscapes of the scenes that are evoked in the music. And so Geogaddi is an interesting example of the band displaying these textures in the context of a record that is considerably darker in approach and considerably more I almost want to say perverse and transgressive than their defining opus, Music Has the Right to Children, that laid out the fundamentals of this sound. This is a record that takes a lot of things that are recognizably Boards of Canada from that album and utilizes them in a context that is much more upsetting, that is much seedier, that is much more, I think, emotionally complex as well. I think that, and Michael and Marcus have spoken to the fact that they feel it reductive to describe any of their music in simplistic terms of being one emotional tone only. I think that a big part of the point of a record like Geogaddi is, yes, to introduce this kind of menacing element to what they do, but it's always the way that that menace, the way that that threat of annihilation even interacts with the kind of nostalgic, gleeful naivety of youth as well. It's a kind of record of contrasts in a lot of ways. It is a record that contrasts the feeling of looking wide-eyed at the world as a child with the feeling of having grown up and then realizing that a lot of the things that you viewed the world as through the lens of wonder as a child are actually kind of terrifying and reminders of the kind of impermanence of living, I guess, when you become an adult. And that's a lot of me sort of reading interpretations onto this music that is very abstract and could come across potentially as pretentious. But I think that Michael and Marcus themselves, if you read the interviews that they've done, if you read into the way that they conceptualize their music, would, I think, back a lot of this up. And it's worth mentioning as well, like, it seems almost obvious considering the time that this record came out, but this record is actually really heavily influenced by 9/11. That was an event that happened during the process of recording for this album. And even though Boards of Canada are Scottish and 9/11, of course, principally an American disaster, it was a sort of tragic global event that nevertheless sent shockwaves across the world. And whether directly or indirectly, it affected the tone of all of the music that followed it. And that's not to say this is a record about that event in any way. It's not really at all. But it is a record that captures a particular feeling that I imagine must have been lingering heavy in the air at that time. In the same way that, you know, it's totally unlike this, but it does that in the same way that an album like Porcupine Trees in Absentia does. Like, it's just a feeling, it's just a shadow that hangs over it. Because of the time
when you read that it was influenced by 9/11, your first reaction is, oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. So the band themselves have described this record in the following, and I'm going to use a direct quote here: a record for some sort of trial by fire, a claustrophobic, twisting journey that takes you into some pretty dark experiences before you reach the open air again. It has a kind of narrative. And I think that's a telling quote, and I think that reinforces a lot of what I think this record instinctively brings to mind as you listen to it. There are textures that evoke fire. There are textures that evoke sort of swirling terror. There are textures that evoke great darkness. There are textures that evoke falling. There are textures that evoke drowning. And there are textures that evoke some kind of release as well. It is a record that has this terrific sense of ebb and flow to it. And it is a record that definitely takes you through the emotional ringer in a lot of ways if you really surrender yourself to it. It's also a record that heavily incorporates biblical references, references to Satan, references to the occult as well. And this is an element that Marcus and Michael have mentioned and have sort of validated to a certain extent, but have also tried to clarify that they're not Satanists. They're not approaching this with anything other than just a sheer fascination with the occult. And there are allusions throughout this record in terms of samples, in terms of like meta aspects of how the album is constructed that allude to like the Book of Revelation, that allude to images that evoke the rapture, the images that evoke like eternal damnation, images that evoke God, and images that evoke Satan. The runtime of the original CD release of this album is 66 minutes and 6 seconds.
And if they put all of these songs together, it takes up 666 megabytes.
Yes, and the original WAV files of the record. Yeah, that's another useful thing. And so those kinds of things, while in the case of most bands, we would be tempted to say that's a coincidence and feel a bit weird and tinfoil hatty reading into it. Boards of Canada encourage this kind of thing. Boards of Canada have baked these kinds of meaningful numerical connections into their music. And this is where we get to an aspect of Boards of Canada's philosophical approach to music that's key, which is that, say it with me, kids, music is math. Math, numbers, the ways in which mathematics and numerology can be used to kind of understand every facet of the world around us is a really strong influence on Boards of Canada. There are tracks here which incorporate the Fibonacci sequence, that incorporate the golden ratio, that incorporate the concept of weird numbers. There's meticulous and numerous references to numerology. And frankly, neither Jake nor I are numerologists. We're not particularly well equipped to dive into and pick apart each of those individual references. If you want a source that will do that for you, visit the BOC Pages website and check out the page on Geogaddi and the pages on all the individual tracks to pick up on the references. They are pretty blatant once you know what you're looking for and once you can pick up on them, but there are plenty of them that are very subtle too. And the point is, this is a record that is so densely packed with detail. Like, there are allusions to specific sort of occult references that will be hidden in a reversed vocal sample that's buried in the mix. So it's like not even audible unless you turn it right up and then like adjust the levels of the track and shit. Like, there are hidden messages and hidden like tidbits and nuggets put on this album that are like hidden so well that it requires actual like musical excavation to unearth them. And there's something about that, before you even approach the music of the album, there's something about that that I think is inherently fascinating and attractive. It's a musical treasure hunt. It is a musical box of riches, but also it's something where you can appreciate the significance of all of those references without recognizing any of them at all, because the feeling that they evoke is so baked into the sound of the album itself, especially when you compare it to the sound of Music Has the Right to Children. And frankly, I don't think you can have a discussion about this album without making a direct comparison in terms of the approach sonically there. But I've talked a lot, as I want to do. Jake, you are newer to Boards of Canada than me, but I know that the first time you heard this record, it left a pretty distinct impression on you, and that's only grown stronger. I'd love to hear from you on what your experiences has been listening to this album, what your immediate reactions were to it, and what your experience is like with it now when you put it on.
It's funny because technically my relationship with this album goes back way further than even when I started to get into music. And it's a shame August can't be here to help me sort of back up what I'm about to say, and also just because these are very some rubber gum ass incorporations are about to happen here. But my first exposure to this is in my first exposure to Boards of Canada unknowingly was through anime, that anime being Death Note. And if you're wondering what the fuck are you talking about, yeah, exactly, is that the soundtrack to that show is made by a Japanese electronic musician, as many 2000s anime were. And I don't know if it's legally come into question, but there are songs on that album that are literally just songs from Music Has the Right to Children, Geogaddi. Like, it's not even like, oh, these things are similar. It's like, oh, that fucking like Turquoise Hexagon Sun. There is a song that is just that on the soundtrack to that. And I listened to those songs in isolation, downloading that soundtrack for years back when I listened to nothing but video game and anime soundtracks in high school because I was a fucking loser. My second exposure was also before my musical inception, because this song on this album, Gyroscope, is used in the 2012-13 horror film Sinister, at a point where Ethan Hawke is burning some shit. And I remember that scene stayed in my mind for years because of the music, because of the drum beat on Gyroscope. That has been in my head forever. So when I listened to this album in full for the first time at the mid to end of last year, and I heard that, I was like, whoa, holy shit, this is that thing. And that's why I remember it. And so when I listened to this, I had a lot of weird nostalgia to it based off of my youth, which feels really eerily poetic, because I think that Geogaddi, in a nutshell, if I'm being broad, is about waning nostalgia, which I think you can sort of glean from all the things that you've said, in that this is an album where all of the sounds on it feel decayed. They feel, something about them feels like they were something else at one point and then were warped and became something else. You hear lots of chiming sounds that are on like the opener, which is sort of like the interlude of Ready, Let's Go, where it almost sounds like an 1980s synth like sound effect you would hear in a movie, but it feels just kind of off or sour, and it'll sort of be incorporated into the ambiance of everything happening on the record. And I think what drew me in about this album initially, when I looked at it from like a more cohesive, holistic point of view, is just how like driven by its percussion it is, but also how simultaneously it doesn't ever sacrifice its atmosphere. A lot of sort of albums in this particular genre, they kind of have a one or the other approach. You know, they have the kind of the classic rhythm or melody kind of thing. And typically when you lean into the more abstract and ambient sounds, that's something that where melody is more of a focus. And when you have like the heavier IDM acid house shit, that's a little bit more rhythmic. Whereas this album feels like a really even mix of both. A weird sort of observation, and one of the reasons that I love the album so much, is really just how the percussion sounds. We use the word texture a lot. There's stuff like on that main kind of tribal sounding cycling beat of Gyroscope, about how when the sort of two objects are colliding to make this sound, you get a feeling that the objects that create the sound are from two totally different worlds, and their combination elicits a sound that only could be harnessed on this song and on this album, that has never been heard once. Or there's just an amazing singularity here. Like Music is Math has the same thing. The way once it just sort of those like 80s sounding chiming synths at the beginning kind of leads into that kind of boom, bum, 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 bum. And it sounds like these like metallic hits are going against each other, and they sound like they have their own world of white noise hitting into one another. And that begins to be the sort of structure of this incredibly hypnotic record, which is focused on the combination of rhythm and melody that kind of lulls you into it. It's a spiraling, the album cover, very evocative of the actual listening experience itself, in my opinion. You sort of have the you have like the person on there, you have the nature, the trees, but it's all being warped and kind of seen through a different lens. And it kind of looks like the whole like lava thing. And you hear in some sort of like some audio passages on here from like old TV commercials and PSAs and stuff about talking about the environment or something. And you just sort of get the impression that the sort of, you know, the post 9/11 context figures into this as well, that the darkness on this record is sort of a parallel of like internal human darkness and the darkness that's felt by looking at the world without that childlike point of view that you can find, I think, in Music is the Right to Children. And that's sort of this album's tethered in many ways, which is a concept I'm obsessed with musically, you know, like ever since I listened to Opeth's Deliverance and Damnation. I'm obsessed with finding albums that have that dichotomy within discographies. And this is like the best single example, and that it's sort of a mirror dark universe version of that album, but not in the sense that like one is childlike and one is sort of soured, but in that they are complicated, but the ways in which they're complicated are totally different. And really, I mean, the name of the game here is atmosphere. Every single proper like beat and sort of rhythm on here, like proper tracks, they're all perfect in my opinion. They're all unlike anything I've ever heard before, but they have that unique singularity that makes you feel like they couldn't have come from anyone other than the people behind, Boards of Canada. And the unique thing about the way this is structured too is that it has a very deliberate like interlude, proper song, interlude, proper song, interlude, proper song, until sort of that end stretch there. And I think that that's something that might turn off some people initially, just because it is kind of heavy on that. But once I think you realize that's sort of integral to how you process the structure of the album, it becomes so much more beneficial. And the spaces, you kind of appreciate the moments of clarity that you're given amidst the very claustrophobic beats on here, which just, I mean, like listening to this on vinyl is absolutely fucking religious. Music is Math, Gyroscope, and Sunshine Recorder are three pieces of music that I think are like peerless, just from what I've heard in this genre, in that they are simultaneously like they're really rhythmic, they're really like persistent, they're really hypnotic and repetitive, but they're also dynamic because the atmospheres of the song are so large, and they'll just sort of mix in these like obscured or waning sounds or vocal samples. Like the Gyroscope, the notable one is the child counting on that, and it's just sort of a crest along the edge of the mix, and it makes it so much eerier and stranger to listen to. And that's all over the place. It's really that this album is just, it's so sonically dense. It's so dense. Like it's just a marvel every time I listen to it.
One thing that's interesting about Gyroscope as well as one that makes it so effective is the way that that drum loop you talked about is panned on the track as well. So it's kind of just moving across the stereo soundscape in a way that makes it feel like you're kind of being chased, or like something is moving around you. It gives it this three-dimensionality that I think enhances how unsettling it is. Another thing I love about that, a story that Marcus Ian has told, is that he dreamed this song and then made it. And like
that's
and he said, like, I've recreated dream songs before, but I managed to do this one so quickly that the end result was 99% like my dream, to the extent that it scares me to listen to it now, which is interesting.
It is kind of an evil sounding song, like, not to overplay that. Like, obviously I agree with what the Boards of Canada guys said about their music being complicated, but there is a persisting, lingering hauntedness on this album that's so distinct. Like once you get to, they have ominous parts in Music is Math and Beware the Friendly Stranger, that kind of interlude, but Gyroscope is the first real look at darkness that feels like occult-like. You can sort of see why they had the designation of the satanic, and the sort of satanic musical panic would be wary of something like this, is because you listen to it and you do instantly think like, yeah, there's something about this that makes it sound distinctly not of this earth almost. And that's, again, just one of the reasons why its complexity is so alluring and singular.
I have some quotes as well from an interview that they did around the time that I think is kind of relevant to understanding the way in which Boards of Canada approach music, and specifically how they approach this record as well. Like with regard to their fascination with maths, I mean, you have a lot of recurring motifs that come up across Boards of Canada albums. One of them is the hexagon, the shape that is on the cover of that album. And the idea, and what that represents in Marcus's words, is the idea of being able to see the world for what it is, which is raw math patterns that make up everything. And they've always been interested in the relationship between science and maths, and religion and maths as well. Sometimes, in Marcus's words, sometimes music or art or drugs can pull back the curtain for you and reveal the Wizard of Oz, so to speak, busy pushing the levers and pressing buttons. That's what maths is, the wizard. It sounds like nonsense, but I'm sure a lot of people know what I'm talking about. The hexagon sun that appears on the cover of Geogaddi is, in Mike's words, probably just a reflection of the way we live our lives. We're a bit ritualistic, which you kind of get evoked with that ring of children on the cover, as well as certain samples on this album. Although we're not religious at all. We're not really conscious of it in our music, but I can see that it is happening. We're interested in symbols. I don't know, we never just make a pleasant tune and leave it at that. It would be pointless. So I suppose there is an intention to let the more adult, disturbed, atrocious sides of our imaginations slip into view through the pretty tunes. So I think that really tells you a lot about how to approach this record and about why the feelings that you get from the music are so significant. One thing that's always struck me about like abstract electronic music is I've always had this really kind of like not quite synesthetic, but a very strong reaction to it where I get certain sensations and images and feelings that I feel very strongly when I'm listening to it, depending on what it is. Like the music evokes that for me. And one of the things that's always been kind of frustrating is that, and sometimes in some ways liberating, I suppose, is that when I experience those images and those feelings, like I'm conscious of the fact that this is all coming exclusively from my head. Like there's nothing really tangible that's feeding why I see this or think this. It's all kind of just my brain making it up. Whereas with Boards of Canada, there's definitely elements of that. Like each person's individual brain is going to interpret sounds through the lens of, you know, that individual person. But what makes them different is the extent to which they openly show you how they're trying to evoke certain things. They openly show you what they're trying to evoke. They very strongly suggest things without trying to be like didactic about it, while still leaving room up for the imagination. But they do kind of reinforce your, if your mind goes crazy listening to it and you're trying to find interpretations and understand connections, the difference with Boards of Canada is how actively they reinforce that behavior, how actively they reward that behavior as well. And it makes their music feel like so enveloping and like something you could truly get lost in trying to decode and understand. And that's one of the things that's so interesting about Geogaddi for me, is that more than any other record that they've made, that this particularly encourages that. Now, I feel like I don't want to dive too much deeper into like the math and messages and all that kind of stuff, because I think we've talked about that clearly and pretty well up to this point. But as for the music of this album, that's its own kettle of fish. What you've mentioned, Jake, how the way that Boards of Canada structure an album, and this is true of Music Has the Right to Children as well, is they will have these interstitial tracks frequently between these larger tracks. And I think when you listen to Boards of Canada enough, you come to appreciate the fact that they aren't really interludes. Like they are intended to be taken as much as the meat of the album as the longer tracks are, but they are fragmented in a way to suggest something more fleeting. And in a lot of ways, they evoke a particular feeling that is so strong, and by its fleeting nature, it disappears so quickly from your ears in terms of what you're hearing, that it leaves this really strong impact in my brain, if that makes any sense at all. What I mean by that is that for me, some of the most visually and sensationally and emotionally evocative music on this album is in the shorter tracks. I find the reversed loop on Dandelion, for instance, to be really just, it gives me full chills when I listen to it. And if you play it backwards, it's even more beautiful for some reason. But by reversing it, it gives it this strange, eerie feel that feels like some memory of my childhood that's evaporating in front of me. It's really strange. The smallest weird number as well, I find to be particularly evocative and haunting and beautiful. Over the Horizon Radar is a gorgeous little piece of music that's buried in the back half of this record that is also reversed like Dandelion, but is equally beautiful in its own way. Little moments on the record like that. A lot of people's first exposure to Boards of Canada will be through David Firth's famous internet series Salad Fingers. And the soundtrack to every episode of that show is the track Beware the Friendly Stranger off of this album. And the thing about this piece of music is it's only about 30 seconds long, but it so strongly evokes this mixture of kind of like childlike wonder and sort of menacing doom in the same sort of like in conflict with each other in a way that makes it genuinely uncomfortable to listen to. And I think that's why Firth picked it for Salad Fingers. It is a remarkably effective piece of music that would be so easy to overlook. Similarly, much like Wildlife Analysis, the opening track on Music Has the Right to Children, Ready Let's Go here has this kind of beautiful, evocative little synth melody to it that is sort of like the experience of being starry-eyed to me. It's like laying in a field and in the middle of the day and kind of just being overwhelmed by the atmosphere of the world around you. It's something that I can't, again, and this is what makes it so powerful to me, is that Boards of Canada so strongly evoke these really sensorial experiences that I have while listening to their music. And they encourage that as well, like a song like The Beach at Red Point, for example, which evokes a very specific geographical location in the same way that Brian Eno does on his Ambient 4 album. When I listen to this, I feel like I am traveling along some kind of vast, expansive, beachy landscape. One of my favorite tracks here, Alpha and Omega, which is just so like, it's so unique in the sounds that they pick to comprise it. It has this sense of like industrial kind of like factories and like landscapes and stuff. It actually very much evokes a lot of the same feelings as Ortega's Triassic Slide, funnily enough. Which
I was actually going to say Burial too, honestly.
Burial too, yeah.
I think it's maybe the most comparable piece on here to something like Untrue.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a feeling there that can only be evoked by the specific combination of the light and fluffy synth sound and the kind of tripping, stumbling, percussive loops. Not to mention the absolute miasma of vocal samples and noises that are loaded into this 7-minute track. I think it's grown to be one of my favorite Boards of Canada songs ever. It's just an absolute experience. Similarly, I think if we're to talk about the drum sound of this record, I think there's so many examples here of where Boards of Canada demonstrate a drum sound that is entirely unique, that is absolutely brain splitting and completely unforgettable. And I could pick any number of songs to demonstrate this, but I think the best example is the absolute classic Julian Candy, which is one, and again, another top 5 Boards of Canada song for me. Possibly my favorite on this record. Actually, it's really tough between that and Alpha and Omega and Sunshine Recorder. But Julian Candy is maybe the most like quintessential Boards of Canada song on this whole album to me. Like it most represents and seems most emblematic of what they're about musically, and also what this record is about musically. And it's something that you said before, Jake, is the sound of decay that you get in the textures of this record, particularly compared to Music Has the Right to Children, where the textures were much more brighter and sort of full of life, whereas here they feel corroded. And I think that the sort of, I don't even know what to describe it as, whether it's like a distorted string sample that's been muffled through a 1940s radio, that it has, and it just sounds so warped and twisted. I mean, what do you think of this track and of these textures and of the and of the drum sound and how hard hitting it is?
It's something that's difficult to relay into words, and that's honestly like the best thing I could say about this album in general, is that it's like, in order to properly appreciate it, I don't think a single human being on earth exists that can properly relay to you exactly what listening to Geogaddi feels like. And there's just so much stuff here that I find, like, you know, it gives you that like mental image, but it's also like, this is why Geogaddi is a real personal album to me, is because it evokes imagery, but it's always imagery that has like a context to me specifically. Whereas with something like Autechre, this isn't like to disparage Autechre or anything. I think that like, I like probably maybe 2 ambient IDM fucking albums like this, or more than this one, and one of them is XI, but that's an album where it's like, it's very external, it feels explorative, it feels like you are witnessing a new world that you've never been to before, or seeing into the vision of this grand future that will never possibly actually come because of how far off it is. But with Geogaddi, it's completely different. It's almost wholly internal, and then just sort of like externalized by its sound that you just sort of feel warped and absorbed by. Julian Candy also starts with this like, before the beat even kind of comes cycling in, it feels like you're hearing a field recording that takes place at like a carnival or something, like a place where children would go to gather and feel some kind of, communal joy, some sort of, or like a park or something. But again, it feels just a little bit off enough, and then it sort of takes you through, and it's that combination of like something that's unsettling but something that's also very uniquely childlike, and it's from the sort of dissonance of that combo that the unique mood that this album puts you in is born. And I also think it's distinctly explored by, again, I'm really gonna struggle picking favorite tracks on this album, just because I just love everything here so fucking much. But exemplified by maybe one of my top 3 favorite songs on here, which is 1969, which is just a fucking marvelous track in and of itself. It kind of starts with this like really dour synth tone and this like electronic like clicking in the background, just kind of builds on top of that, and it gives you those really metallic percussive hits that just kind of feel like they're pushing and cresting along the sides of your brain. It's very gives me the same feeling that Beach House's 7 does with its drum machines, where it's so specifically textured that you feel like the music is touching you, and you're not always totally okay with it on this album. It's a little weird, especially like on moments like You Could Feel the Sky, which like a great track, but my God, that fucking stretching noise that's sort of repeated and looped over and over again. You're just like, oh God, it feels like I'm hearing someone stretch skin over bone. It's so fucking unsettling. But back on 1969, this is something where it evolves into this like shimmering synth passage where this completely indiscernible vocal tone is like speaking to you, and it really does feel like you're falling through this like wave of surreal imagery, and it just kind of keeps winding back in and out of that kind of really exploratory psychedelic noise and the sort of claustrophobia of the drum beat, and just the way that they can get mileage out of the fact that it's like, we have this drum beat and this one and this one, and they just know exactly what kind of alchemy to infuse these tracks with to make them feel vast. Like, these songs aren't exactly something I would describe as spacious, but they evoke a world inside of you, and it sounds fucking ridiculous, but it's just true. I can't think of any other album I've ever listened to, genre regardless, that makes me feel quite like Boards of Canada's music does, but very specifically this one. It's because it's so purely transportative that I end up preferring Geogaddi to Music as the Right to Children, which are both masterpieces, but Music as the Right to Children is almost something that feels comfortable in some ways to me, whereas this feels like it takes me out of my comfort zone and pushes me into something that nothing else is able to evoke ever. This is a full 5 sensory experience for me. At some point you begin to feel like it's synesthesia. You taste the sounds that are made here. You feel the sounds that are made here. It's just so satisfying.
And they leverage their ability to do that to really create an experience that is, deeply discomforting, and like what you connect to really, really strongly. Like, I noticed when, like, the last couple of listens to this, when I was really kind of just trying to like isolate the moments that really stand out to me. And there's just little stuff that you could overlook for the first 50 listens of this album. And then on listen 51, it just hits you that opening the mouth sounds to me like it just sounds like a twisted, distorted scream, but like pitched up and made to sound like wind. And there's something about it that the first 20 times I heard this album, I might have just skimmed right over it. But now it just hits me when I get it, and I just feel this full visceral physical reaction to it, and it's so effective.
Fucking Dawn chorus starts with what I like to think is a slowed down ice cream truck tune from hell, and then those fucking strings just swallow that noise like a
listen
minute
to
in,
how
and
like
it's so good.
how distorted that like that wave of synth sound or whatever it is that comes in sounds like. It's so loud,
wavy,
and yeah, it's so loud and so kind of clipped and shit that it's like it's like steering. It's like you're fucking steering into the sun and your eyes are burning, is what I feel when I listen
and
to
that
that.
child vocal effect, the like, oh, it sounds so atonal and weird.
It's twisted and edited and clipped up so that you can, it sounds like a scream, but you can't tell whether it's a scream of joy or like a scream of wonder or a scream of terror, or whether it's alternating between those different emotions. It sounds so bizarre and so captivating. When I first heard this album as a kid, this was my favorite song on it. This was the song that always resonated with me the most, because
amazing pick.
It was just like there was some feeling that it gave me, some intensity that has always resonated with me. And I mentioned earlier that Marcus and Michael have said that this album kind of has a narrative. And I think that that could be interpreted in an oblique way, or it can be interpreted in a more concrete way. But I'm curious, like, if you have an opinion or a perception on like whether there is a narrative to this record in your estimation, or whether there is like some kind of journey that you're being taken on, that whether that means that the ending of this record has a special significance. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that at all.
There's certainly a very distinct emotional journey for me that happens on here. And part of the reason I really, really like it is because of how versatile that journey feels, and that I never feel like I'm being taken on the exact same journey as the journey before with each re-listen. It really does feel like it goes to that density that you spoke of, where I feel like the density and the versatility of all of the music here can almost warp to suit any kind of mood or story that you can draw up from your brain. It feels like something that, it really does feel like they mathematically formed this to be as emotionally oblique as possible. And I mean that in the absolute best ways, because one of my favorite things about this genre of music is my ability to be purely transported by instrumentation. And I think it's just that each song in and of itself manages to set its own tone so well. There's like, without fail, there's like 10 to 15 seconds on the beginning of each and every proper song on here that feels like it's slate clearing, that feels like a distinct sonic idea that's sole purpose is to be interrupted by the main idea of the song. And it lures you in with that, and you immediately are taken to an emotional or visual place by that. And then the effect of the actual beats and cycling and rhythms and whatnot are how that interruption is affecting the world that it initially creates, which I think is kind of emblematic too of like what the album is saying, of like the sort of allusions that it makes to like the world, like climate change, like, the shit it has with like those spoken word, like commercial messages and stuff, is that it's sort of, interrupting the natural order of things. It's taking something distinctly organic and then perverting it. And that perversion isn't necessarily like good or bad, but it's that perversion that ends up being the wavelength you have to get on for this. And it's just so smart in the way it's constructed. Like the more you learn about this album's construction, especially when it comes to math, the more the way everything here just kind of all fits into place. And that, like, you don't need to know all those things to appreciate it. But once you do know that, you're just like, oh, this explains why this part of it feels like stilted, or why this part of it feels so, it just manages to have an amazing level of conveyance in its ideas, that it doesn't necessarily, like, the satanic shit is kind of cool, and unfortunately misunderstood by many people, but also it's that, like, in a song like Gyroscope, you should be able to tell that there's some satanic shit on here by the way that song fucking sounds. No one should have to tell you that this album has weird, evil shit on it, because it does. But that's part of the magic of it, There's something ephemeral about it that's just mwah.
I'll tell you the song that when I first listened to this as a kid, like always unsettled me the most. and made me like, I wanted to, I really liked it. I liked a lot of elements about it, but I also hated listening to it because of how much it upset me. And that's Devil in the Details. Which has this kind of like sort of lilting start stop melody and underlying bass, which is like incidentally time shifted apart from each other at exactly the golden ratio, another numerical thing.
That the vocal sample on this song, just, it's spine chilling. It's the oh god.
And there's another vocal sample that sounds like someone is like trying to speak, but their head is being held underwater. It's like there's this weird feeling of like, I don't know, like again, the image that this evokes is like drowning. It's like
that like the speaking underwater thing, you know what it reminded me exactly of? It's on the Mars Volta's Francis the Mute on Elvia Kes, how that song, it like gradually kind of becomes distorted more and more and more. And the way Cedric's vocal sound at the end of that is a dead ringer for how that vocal sound effect sounds in this song.
I can hear it now that you said that. That's actually, there's just other, like I talked about how opening the mouth is just this like little thing that I only really noticed like after a certain period of time, and is now like permanently haunts me. And also like another little track that I love is Diving Station, which has this little gentle sort of piano melody. And I love that you can't, and this is something that Mike, who composed the melody, has spoken on, where you can't quite discern any clear emotional tone. He says, I wanted the song to express a bittersweet feeling that on the surface is comfortable, but has something ominous beneath it. That contrast of emotion is something we focus heavily on. Nothing is ever polarized to either positive or negative. And it's, again, like certain other moments like Dandelion, for instance, it's an easy moment to overlook when you're sort of first experiencing the record. But it's so crucial to and emblematic of the feel of the entire thing. And it's just this little beautiful oasis before the album moves into its kind of dark final stretch that I absolutely treasure. Similarly, like the arc of the end of the album, if we're to talk about sort of narratives, I don't have a clear picture of a narrative to me, but the end of this album feels like dying. Like it feels like you are leaving your body, or at least like your consciousness is evaporating. That to me is what You Could Feel the Sky into Corsair feels like. You just could feel the sky has a beautiful structure to it, because it starts with what you've referred to, that snapping kind of bending sound that's so uncomfortable, and it kind of just slowly becomes something much more atmospheric and eerie with these vocal samples that are like serving the purpose of a synth.
Sounds like the Silent Hill 2 soundtrack.
And it just kind of eventually sort of evaporates into this very spooky ending. And then Corsair comes in. And of all of the tracks on this album, over the decade that I've had this album in my life, this is the one where like my emotional experience and reaction to it has shifted the most, or is the most malleable. To me, this song is equally like comforting and beautiful and warm, and it holds me. It's bittersweet and it's longing, and it makes me feel like everything I love is falling away from me and I'm completely alone in the universe. It makes me feel like the Hubble Space Telescope as much as it makes me feel like I'm standing in the middle of Times Square. All of these things, this little piece of drumless beauty makes me feel. And I guess if I'm to think about it in terms of the arc of the album, it feels like dissolving into the air. It feels like all of the little atoms that make you up are just kind of evaporating slowly. And this song kind of gradually eases away into the silence of Magic Window, the very purposeful silence of Magic Window, where you are left to dwell in nothingness for the end of the record. It's quite powerful, I think, to experience that. I don't know. What do you think of that those last couple tracks on this album?
I mean, I really couldn't have said it, but I love the Hubble Space Telescope analogy, just because I do think it's like floating through space, and it's just sort of, there's something bittersweet about it. There's an innate beauty to it, but again, it's a beauty that feels altered. It's a beauty that feels warped, beauty at a distance of some kind. It all overall, just like the way it ends, it's contemplative. It's like it makes you remember and recall the journey that you've been on. I think it's amazing how this album manages to have like so much sonic density and like little pieces that I remember, but I'll come back to certain songs and there'll just be moments in it that I just don't even remember happening. And I think that's kind of by design. And then when you reflect on all of it, you realize just how much the experience you remember and felt affected by and how it changed or felt different for you. An album with a very similar emotional tone and structure and feeling to this is, I can't believe I never made this connection before, but it's my favorite album by the band The Flaming Lips, which is The Terror. And The Flaming Lips have always music to me evokes childhood, that evokes nostalgia. And on albums like The Terror, it's their sole goal to make it feel like an encompassing wave of dread is about to interrupt that. It's not about being purely evil or sounding purely death-like. It's about deterioration and change, and about how change and evolution and growth is like, you become a new person when you grow up, but you also leave that old person behind. And it's the simultaneous embrace of the fact that, you consist of atoms that were 10 years ago didn't even exist. And 10 years from now, your body will be a completely different one than the one it is now. It's embracing the destruction that comes with growth, but also, the innate positivity as well. It's not a monotone emotional experience. It's diverse, and it's only backed by the fact that the actual sonic ideas on this album are so versatile, are so all-encompassing, are different and refreshing, and still sound cutting edge, but also cohesive somehow. It's a marvel of an album. It's truly like genuinely one of the most vital and like fascinating musical experiences I've ever had.
I can't think of a better place to wrap it up, to be honest. That's a beautiful note to end on. The only other thing I'll mention, just as an aside, is there's also a Japanese bonus track that is relevant because it is a song that is based around samples of children talking about what God is to them. And it is and I think it's interesting to note in the arc of the album, because the album ends so perfectly with Magic Window, but if you were to consider this addendum as like an epilogue to the album, and you're to consider it within the arc of like dying, then you could see it as a kind of like strangely happy ending where after death you are not consigned to the eternal silence of the magic window.
It could work into the arc.
You're not consigned to the eternal silence that Magic Window represents, but that there is actually something beautiful beyond that. And it's kind of interesting to me that's only a song that's on this special edition bonus version of the album. The actual version of the album ends very meaningfully with that silence, but there is this alternate ending that also exists. And I think that poses an interesting wrinkle into any interpretation of this record, but also neatly exemplifies the fact that with Boards of Canada, nothing is ever quite clear, nothing is ever quite set in stone. They love to leave it up to interpretation to a certain extent. They like to feed you the crumbs, but they want to see how your own individuality informs the way that you read all of that. And that's, I think, what's beautiful about Boards of Canada. What's beautiful about this album as well is that it encourages that so deeply. And yeah.
That's why I'm looking forward to seeing the rest of their music. Because like I said in the podcast this week, that it's like I've been listening to mostly Autechre and Boards of Canada. I've mostly just been listening to this and Music as the Right to Children, just because those are such all-encompassing albums. And from all intents and purposes, I know that their other work is like more than worthwhile. It's just so difficult to get past these two, which are just so, I mean, it feels like any amazing musical discovery I've made, where I just have to entrench myself in some of these works because they feel groundbreaking and they feel so whole.
So another cool thing you just reminded me of is, so the other most essential release from this band is the In a Beautiful Place Out in the Country EP, which is my second favorite EP of all time, and actually bridges the gap between music and Geogaddi really well, because it's kind of like a middle ground of those two albums.
Interesting.
But another connection is that the song 1969 on this album, there's a vocal sample that refers to the Branch Davidians, which is a religious extremist cult that you may know
Oh,
from their
yeah.
association with the Waco massacre in Texas. And that is a particular motif or example of like, let's just say unconventional religion that that Boards of Canada use or evoke to give that kind of sensation. But there's actually the title track on the Beautiful Place EP specifically alludes to that in more detail and provides another link. So yeah, there's all sorts of connections that go between releases even. And what I would say is their third and fourth albums get less love because they're not the totemic masterpieces that Children and Geogaddi are, but they're so worth hearing. Like I could see you fucking with Campfire Headphase in particular. That is like closer to an ambient record than their previous two records, but it also like has a greater presence of guitar on it. It's just like, it's a super duper cool record. And then Tomorrow's Harvest is like an ambient record, but it's also like a record about a nuclear holocaust as well, like imagining the end of the world. It's cool as shit. Those records are awesome. Tomorrow's Harvest manages to make like the classic Boards of Canada sound modern and slick, which is a really impressive achievement. Anyway, I just love this band so much. We haven't
Waystar Royco Massacre.
We haven't talked about them before, and they have such a small catalog where it's all fucking diamonds. And I made so much like shitty music as a teenager where I would sample them and I would just like, they had such a profound influence on me. And maybe we don't talk about them as much because they're like, they haven't put out an album in 9 years and they're not really terribly active.
Campfire Headphase has a fucking 3.72 on Rate Your Music, which I mean, Christ.
It's a great
record. That's a big one.
It's a great record. I have a lot of appreciation for it. I don't listen to it as much, but I do think that it deserves a little bit more love and maybe a bit of a reevaluation, even if it does sort of strip back some of the heavy percussion aspect. Anyway, let's leave it there. Favorite tracks and ratings for Geogaddi. Jake, why don't you go first?
All right, my 3 favorite tracks on Geogaddi are probably I gotta say I do have a lot of love for Gyroscope because technically that's most my nostalgic attached song. 1969 and Corsair. Least favorite track, there's nothing inessential on here. If you took out any piece of music or even the fucking silence of Magic Window, the album is a lesser experience in my opinion. This is a 10 out of 10 album.
My 3 favorites are Sunshine Recorder, Julian Candy, and Alpha and Omega. Least favorite, again, I don't really have one either. I basically agree with the sentiment that this all kind of hangs together flawlessly. And I'm also going to give this a 10 out of 10. I'm bumping this from a 9.5 to a 10 just this morning. So now Boards of Canada now join the elite club of artists with multiple 10s from me. Which means that Geogaddi has, well, I should also mention Geogaddi has a rating of 9 from August and a rating of 8.5 from Morgan. Morgan, I think, did say that he really enjoyed listening to this and he appreciates the aspect of it sounding like someone has done something fucked up to something that was beautiful, which essentially is a sentiment that you said in as many words as well. Morgan's favorite tracks are Alpha and Omega, Music is Math, and Dawn Chorus. And Morgan gives it an 8.5 out of 10. So we have a 10 from Jake, a 9 from August, an 8.5 from Morgan, and a 10 from me. That is an average for Geogaddi of 9.4. But anyway, let us know at home, what do you think of Boards of Canada's Geogaddi? What does this record mean to you? What are your interpretations of what this album is all about? What the brothers are trying to do with the incorporation of the samples in this album? What are your thoughts and feelings? And what does this album mean to you? Do you have a special connection to this record? Is it your favorite Boards of Canada record? Is it not your favorite Boards of Canada record? Let us know in the comments on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Music, go and visit YouTube and let us know what you think of this record. Give the video a like. If you're listening on a podcast service, if you give us 5 stars as well, that would make a huge difference. If you enjoy what we do and you're not already subscribed to the channel, please consider doing that as well. If you want to go above and beyond and support us further, you can hit the join button on our YouTube page. And for just $1 a month, you can support us and get your name featured in the title crawl of every YouTube video on this channel, as well as getting priority comment response. And if you want to recommend us a record to listen to, if you're a member, it'll go straight to the top of the pile. So that's optional as well. But anyway, thanks for watching. Happy birthday to Boards of Canada's Geogaddi. Rock over London, rock on Chicago, Ent Energy. We power life.